Let me introduce our first moderator, the Honorable Gordon Griffin, a former ambassador to Canada, and he will introduce our first panel.
Thanks, Jim. It's always a little depressing to be introduced by what you used to do, but I am still in life. It's a delight to be with you here today at the Canadian Embassy with a remarkable panel, and I'm going to move right into this. I'm going to introduce each of them as I ask them a question, so when I introduce Dr. Moinz, don't think that I'm ignoring the rest, but I'm going to go to him first. And obviously I don't need to spend much time on introducing Dr. Moinz. MIT, obviously, I also recall that he was an important actor in the President's Office of Science and Technology Policy during the Clinton administration, which some of us overlook when we talk about what his contributions have been. And of course, most recently, the founder of the Energy Futures Initiative and chair of NTI, where he's making a material contribution in the nuclear proliferation, or non-proliferation, I guess, initiatives. Canada-U.S., obviously I was involved in the panoply of Canada-U.S. issues, and the integration of Canada and the United States and our societies and our economies is unlike anything else anywhere in the world between two sovereign countries. And in many cases, it has evolved because of private sector and in some measure state and local initiatives, either without the federal governments either knowing or contributing to the outcome, which is a positive statement. Just people and businesses and societies making a difference to look for efficiencies. And certainly the electric power industry is near the top of that list in my judgment. An awful lot of initiatives and evolution over the years have occurred because of proximity, geographic proximity across our border with power going north and south, depending on the time of year. One thing is absolutely true, there's a lot of power generation capacity in Canada and not very many people. There's a lot more capacity than there is long-term demand. We got a lot more people, and the challenge for us, which Dr. Moinz knows better than I, is to figure out how to supply that demand in an increasingly clean fashion, which again, Canada is part of the answer to that riddle. It is something that I suggest, though, that has evolved very effectively over the years, but not because of a coherent, broad perspective that facilitates that development. And so one of the things I want our panel to talk about is how we overlay now a more coherent plan going forward. And I'd even suggest we consider there's an enterprise called the International Joint Commission, IJC, which administers the Boundary Waters Treaty from 1909, and how we co-manage our contiguous water resources. I wonder if having an institution that would have the charge of enhancing the infrastructure and the flow efficiently of power north and south wouldn't be a good idea, whether a power IJC wouldn't be a good idea to go beyond just reliability, which is something that I've thought about a little bit. So let me turn to Dr. Moinz to kick all of this off, and someone who's done an awful lot of critical and complex international transactions between countries, obviously during his tenure in government, and I know you've got a lot of thoughts to contribute to this this group this morning, but in the context of your Green Real Deal, which really is setting the framework, I think, for the development of clean power here and throughout the world, what do you see, how do you envision more efficient collaboration between Canada and the United States, both to satisfy demand going forward, but to do it in the framework of what you're talking about in the clean power arena?
Well, first of all, Gordon, I think it's probably worth emphasizing how even in the relatively short time since the Paris Agreement, late in 2015, there's been quite a shift built upon the evolving science. For example, as captured in the IPCC report last year, in terms of the rather dramatic difference projected between even a 1.5 and a 2 degree centigrade rise. The US government's comprehensive climate assessment, where this is all leading to what's a pretty dramatic shift. Whether or not we're on track to achieve the Paris goals, a reminder that the Paris goals for mid-century were essentially an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases, and now increasingly what we're seeing is the replacement of that goal by what's called net zero, which is considerably more challenging, even if the first goal wasn't challenging enough. So in that context, what you've already alluded to is pretty clear. For the United States in particular, the integration with Canada and the opportunities for getting additional carbon-free electricity is absolutely essential. Now, so the question is, what are the barriers and how do you get there? A couple of comments. One is, when I was secretary, we rejuvenated not only a bilateral but a trilateral energy ministerial meetings, and I think that in that venue, whether it's the formal kind of commission or not that you stated, in that venue we were able to get specific initiatives going, which started with data. We noticed at that time that it was interesting how the infrastructure maps of the United States had the termination of transmission lines and pipes at the border. Nothing apparently went across the border. It was quite remarkable, and including in the Gulf region, for example, hurricanes only stopped at the border with Mexico in that case, et cetera. So we got our data agencies together and produced kind of integrated infrastructure maps. So that's only a first step, but that's a kind of venue that I think still has lots of legs, and it could, in that framework, have some more formal institutional structures. That's one point. Second point, let me say, since you mentioned Green Real Deal, let me say that the Green New Deal, as far as energy and climate goes, really makes only two statements. One is we should go to low carbon, and two, we should do it in a way that emphasizes social justice issues up front, which is a very important issue for us and a very important issue for Canada, quite clearly. The Green Real Deal for us then is saying, okay, those are good principles, important principles. We obviously accept those principles, but now we have to translate that into a program. And the Green Real Deal framework, which anybody who's interested can find on the Energy Futures Initiative website, is our framework, our principles, and our elements for getting there. That includes pragmatism, that includes coalition building, and so for the United States, for example, labor and business, financial institutions, environmental groups, we could go on in terms of coalition building. But another issue was we emphasized very strongly the need for focusing on the regionality of solutions. Low carbon is going to look very, very different in different parts of the country. And one of those regional focus areas surely has to be the northeastern United States integrated with Canada. because that now going back and tying the net zero to the northeastern United States with a significant dearth of of low carbon assets is one where that integration is absolutely critical. I would just, maybe we'll come back to this later. I'll just end by saying, of course, in the Northeast, one of the assets could be the further development of nuclear power, but that seems to be, to a good approximation, off the table for the moment. So we need to find a way of looking at a complete picture, for example, in that region, and to repeat the obvious, Canadian hydro, in my view, is an absolutely necessary part of that integrated picture, and we got to get the infrastructure to support it.
Thank you. Very good context for our conversation, and obviously by infrastructure, one of the things that this organization has a focus on is transmission, and in order to get Canadian clean power to consumers in the United States, it requires transmission, which seems to be challenging.
Can I just add one point? Sure. It's challenging. So we know it's challenging there, but I'll give you just another example internally. In 2007, the Congress, in the Energy Security Act, gave Department of Energy some prerogatives for establishing high voltage transmission lines to move renewables. That included an absolute beautiful case as far as the law was concerned of moving large wind resources from Oklahoma to a point in Tennessee where you could hook into the TVA system, and it was a beautiful example to implement. The only problem was called Arkansas, and that line is not happening, right? So anyway.
Well, thank you very much. And in the context of Canada, it's interesting. I get a little confused because the word hydro in Canada is used to mean a lot of things, but particularly it means electricity, not necessarily generated by hydro assets. You know, in Ontario, there's probably 50% nuclear power generation, and it's all called hydro. So. To your point about regional differences, decarbonization, at least in my mind, means reduction of carbon, not necessarily in every case total elimination of it. As you move west in Canada, you'll have more natural gas-fired power generation, but it's taking the place of coal, which on a net basis is gaining ground. So, Francis, I want you to hit cleanup for the Expo. So I'm going to jump you for a minute and go over to Lonnie. Lonnie Stephenson is the international president of the IBEW, and it's terrific to have you here as a contributor to this panel, because having labor involved in the conversation is critical, and having someone who's got international perspective and international responsibilities for labor in this context is critical. And I really want to draw out from you your perspective from that seat of responsibility, because like business and our environment and our economy, labor is integrated in North America, and there are times where people argue, for example, that labor should be against the idea of importing power from Canada, because if you do that, you're not building plants in the Northeast, and the jobs that would be associated with building those plants might not materialize. But from the perspective of an integrated labor perspective, is it constructive from your perspective to be importing power that enhances economic development in the United States, which presumably would bring about the creation of new jobs. They might be different than building power plants, but they might still be the new economy jobs. So the perspective of labor is awfully important here.
Well, I think, first of all, thank you for the opportunity, the invitation to attend the summit. The IBEW, just so you know, we represent about 775,000 active and retired members across the United States and Canada, and 400,000 plus directly in the energy business. So we work very closely in both countries, have great relationships with our employers, and and we're looking at the especially the transmission and coming across the borders, and on the power. We're working on the jobs north of the border as well, and so we're very proud of that. And so when we're able to import some of that power, like example up in the Northeast with all the hydro, we just completed that big huge hydro project up there a couple of years ago now, and I know we've got the opportunity to now bring that some of that power into the resource of the Boston area, for example. But once we cross the border, then we have more issues with permitting and that, and how we get it from point A to point B, as always seems to be what our challenge is. But with the work that's going forward in both countries, one of the challenges we have right now is trying to secure where we need to be for the number of our members, our workers in the industry, particularly in the construction side. Because we've got a lot of our members in construction are the retired baby boomer generation, and a lot of them are continuing to retire. And when we're looking and working with our employers and trying to forecast how many linemen and women we're going to need, in the future for both countries, we need to have some, some amount of reliability of what we know is going to happen, what transmission is going to be out there, so we can get those apprentices in the program and get them started. And it's a 3 or 4 year program, depends on where you're at, but once they get through the program, in my opinion, you're just learning the line industry. Once you finish your apprenticeship, then that's when you really learn. And so when we've got a better idea of the work that's going to be involved, that helps us judge where we need to be in the numbers and working with our employers, not only on the construction side, but even with our utility employers as well, as they're faced with the same situation of having a lot of retirees over the next 10 years. It's still a huge amount of skilled labor is going to be retiring across both countries. But we also work with, and it was already mentioned with, when we have the mutual aid program and there's storms and things like that, that we're able to work and get linemen back and forth across the border. Right now, we've got a shortage of linemen in the U.S., so we're actually working to try to encourage and get more of our Canadian members across the border to help us. And sometimes that raises issues as well, of getting work visas and things of that nature. So, we've got some constraints in doing that, but we've got some skilled people that we could bring down to help us in our need. But as far as the work, we know we're moving into the renewable energy, and that provides some opportunities for us. We build a lot of we do a lot of the wind projects, we do a lot of the solar projects, the gas, where we're converting coal to gas. Like I said, we're still losing a lot of members on the coal end of generation, because you can take 200 people work at a coal plant and convert that to gas, and it might be 30 people. So we're continuing to lose members in that nature. And we also believe that nuclear has got to be part of the equation. If you're clearly going to have a carbon-free and reliable, you got to have a good nuclear base as well.
So
Can I just add,
Sure,
in this
please.
context of the Northeast not having a lot of low carbon resources, wind was mentioned, and I'd just say that, of course, offshore wind in the Northeast is kind of coming on strong, and there's an enormous supply chain yet to be built, including, on land to service that developing industry.
Which would provide a lot of new economy jobs.
Yeah.
But would it be fair to say, Lonnie, that from the perspective, your seat, that the international border that we have, forget all the permitting and work visas and that sort of thing, but the international border for purposes of jobs really doesn't exist. It's a question of the economy, the combined economy, and what's going on to provide jobs in that bigger context.
Yes, in both the United States and Canada, we're always looking at the job opportunities, obviously, for our members. And but like I said, it sometimes because of the border, there is some challenges when we need more resources in one country or the other. When we've got the way it typically seems like you'll have strong economy and a big boom in one area and maybe a little slower in others. And so we're able to take especially on the construction side, our linemen and women, and that maybe, from the Northeast or something, and maybe the work's a little slow there for us, but if they're mobile, they'll go anywhere in the country, United States or Canada, where we need those additional workers. And so that's one of the advantages I think we have. That's one of the advantages our employers have, because they know that, the resources of linemen and women that's available, they could utilize throughout both countries, as needed.
This is why I like my idea of having an institution that could break down some of the formalities that get in the way of the efficiencies that can, if we have a ice storm in Vermont, having to wait for the linemen to find their passports and fill out the
Right.
forms in Quebec to come down and help is not particularly productive. So we need to work on that. Thank you. And as we go forward, I want to just make this a conversation.
Sure.
Richard, let me pull you in here. Richard is the Senior Vice President of the Edison Electric Institute and leads the industry actually on activity related to clean energy supply and all sorts of finance-related challenges. I guess I wanted to ask you from the perspective of the U.S. industry, at least from my time as U.S. Ambassador in Canada, I find that Canadians generally, and certainly in each industry segment, are much more aware of and sensitive to the dynamic of the opportunity to work with their counterparts in the United States than necessarily those on the U.S. side of the border are. We're a lot bigger, and we, from time to time, have larger egos, so we think we're a lot more self-contained than maybe we are. I used to analogize it to that we'd look through the same telescope from opposite ends. The Canadians look at the end where everything's magnified, and the United States looks at the end where everything's in the distance and a little fuzzy. So my question really to kick this off from your perspective is, from the American industry, U.S. industry, is there a sense of the opportunity to integrate more with Canada, to make this more seamless and to make the 49th parallel an interesting legal line, but not something that's an impediment in any way to the integration and growth and development of how we work together, not just on security, not just on reliability, but on the broader vision of efficiencies and figuring out how to together get into this decarbonized real deal.
Well, I can't comment on the telescope, but first I want to say, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be on this panel. And as you say, we partner with our colleagues at CEA in Canada. We partner with labor, and I think that the transformation that you're seeing in the U.S. that's taking place right now is also taking place in Canada, and there's a lot going on with respect to integration of the companies. I mean, you've seen many of the Canadian companies coming into the U.S. merging for a lot of different reasons. So I think in terms of strategy, in terms of leading the transformation to the lower carbon energy economy, the companies are really very much aligned, and I think that direction is pretty clear. I think the good news for companies on both sides of the border is that this remains the most capital intensive industry, and I think the good news is the capital markets are open to the companies on both sides of the border, and in fact are facilitating some of these combinations that you're seeing, which I think will ultimately lead toward greater integration. So I definitely think that that the conditions are very, very good, that our companies, the investor-owned segment, which in the U.S. is about 75% of all the electric companies, is really well positioned to help bring that transition to fruition. And I think the industry going forward, it is the most capital-intensive industry. It's going to remain the most capital-intensive industry, which makes it all the more important that we collaborate and work closely with our friends on both, in Canada, as well as our partners in labor. This year alone, our industry raised and deployed about $128 billion in capital. And with respect to your observation about greater integration between Canada and the U.S., I think we've been at this elevated level of capital spend for about 10 years. And if you look at the sort of allocation within that, early on it was much more focused on coal switching and on new generation. Lately, though, it's been much, much more focused toward transmission and distribution. And I think that is a positive development, will help with this integration, with the fact that that's really becoming increasingly the focus of the industry's capital spend. So I'm very hopeful. I do think that there's a lot of dialogue going on. I mean, between EEI and CEA and our membership and EPRI and others that are out there. There's a tremendous amount of dialogue going on about the common problems and common issues. And I'm really proud that our companies, partnering with labor and others, are really leading this transition to the lower carbon energy economy, pulling on all these resources, but recognizing that you do need, on the generation side, a really diverse mix of resources, and that includes Canadian hydro.
Gordon, you mentioned the word ego. I just want to say that we shouldn't overlook the opportunity presented by having moved the U.S.-Canada trade relationship from the worst deal ever to the greatest.
Yeah, well, having been involved in what has been called the worst deal ever, our economies in North America have done pretty well as a consequence of that deal, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Yes, it is.
It did, without getting into the debate of the merits of NAFTA, just the fact that that template existed, I think, caused people to think about our economies differently and to think about integration of our economies. It used to be a difficult conversation in some places in Canada because there was a concern that it would just be overwhelming the Canadian economy and, in effect, taking over the Canadian economy. And to the contrary, it made many sectors in Canada more productive, more profitable, and I think the economy there has benefited dramatically. Well, and I think it's opened the door, if you will, or I don't know what the right metaphor would be for electricity, opened the switch for efficiencies in this area. And I have to observe that the lawsuit that was filed this week, I find somewhat somewhere between troubling and comical, but I guess the lawsuit I'm talking about is the Department of Justice filing. I think it's more about pique with California than it is the merits of the lawsuit. I think having administered an awful lot of arrangements on the state and local level as ambassador, if a commercial deal between Quebec and California is illegal and somehow contravenes the Constitution, there are thousands of deals, transactions, that are going to get stacked up on some judge's desk that they're going to have to sort through. So I don't suspect that lawsuit's going very far, but we'll see. So we're to the cleanup batter for the Washington Expos here, we may get diverted with Francis telling us about growing up watching the Expos at Jerry Park.
Opening day, 1969.
In Montreal. But he's all excited about what's going on in the World Series as a result. So the CEO of CEA really is someone, I think, who has the most intense perspective for the efforts to achieve this integration that I keep talking about, because he's been working on it in one form or another for a couple of decades. And he's been looking at it through the magnified end of the telescope. And Francis, I know you've worked on an awful lot of the initiatives that have provided progress and permitted us to be where we are. But from your perspective, again, I know there's been a lot done on reliability cross-border and security cross-border. But from your perspective, are there opportunities to address the, let's say, governmental on either side of the border, regulatory constraint, bottlenecks on a more fluid intercontinental system?
Right. Well, first, I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to join this panel and be part of this discussion. There's going to have to be, absolutely, given the scope and scale of the challenge that we're facing to begin with, and the very different position from a resource standpoint and a population standpoint, as mentioned earlier, that Canada is in vis-a-vis the United States. Martin had taken my favorite line that I stole from your CEO about the importance of electricity in the Canadian economy, where it's it's the $30 billion of GDP, but it's the first $30 billion, and everything else is built upon it. If you think of our geography and you think of our climate, electricity is probably even more important in Canada than it is in some jurisdictions in the United States. When we have ice storms in the middle of the winter, and it's 20 below, 30 below, 40 below, we're talking about a real lifeline sector, and we've seen some pretty significant events over the very recent past, including just in the last couple of days in Manitoba with a pretty significant storm. $110 million in damage was the last I read, but I know it's still being looked at. Absolutely. So we're in a situation where we're actually seeing a pretty significant ramp up and increase in extreme weather. So that's sort of in the background to all of this. Where CEA's offices are in Ottawa, 2 of the last 3 years we've seen a 1 in 100 year flood event. So that's part of the background as well. These challenges with respect to extreme weather. And at the same time, what role will electricity and, in a North American context, Canadian electricity play in the decarbonization of the North American economy? Clearly, it's going to be, I think, a pretty significant outsized role. Once again, electricity is one of the few areas where, in a North American context, Canada probably punches a little bit above its weight, and I think that is only going to increase. We've been doing some, looking at some research that's been undertaken both in the United States and some in Canada in terms of, and you'd mentioned the Paris Agreement. What would it mean if we moved closer towards meeting some of those 2050 targets? What does it do to the electricity system? Well, in the electricity system in Canada, it will require probably at least a doubling of electricity to be able to meet that future demand if we are going to approach an 80% reduction. So just in a Canadian context, and there was some discussion about this during the cocktail last night with a number of people, how important is transmission going to be? Well, everything is going to be important. If we're looking at doubling the demand for electricity decarbonized electricity, it means that distributed energy resources, large-scale hydro, nuclear, wind, and greater interconnection, all of that is going to be required if we're going to get anywhere near that, just in a Canadian context. And we're already starting from a place where 82% of our electricity is non-emitting. From a North American perspective, frankly, I look at the challenge we have in Canada to decarbonize, and it is daunting. I look at the challenge through that telescope, and the challenge is even more significant here in the United States, given the starting point. And so I think it's absolutely critical that we have these informed discussions on an ongoing basis. It's great to talk about what the 2050 target is, but as a number of people have mentioned, it's very difficult today to build the infrastructure that's going to be required just to meet the requirements of 5 to 10 years from now, to meet the requirements for 30 years from now. And that much more infrastructure is going to be even a greater challenge. So collaboration and coordination between Canada and US, regulatory collaboration and coordination is going to be absolutely essential. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to get any of this done. And the slow pace with which infrastructure is, particularly linear infrastructure, whether it's pipelines or transmission lines, the challenges and the slow pace with which that's being deployed, even within Canada and within the United States, and then add to that the complexity of multi-jurisdictions and trying to get things through Arkansas. That's the same reality that we're living right now. Mm-hmm. Will we be able to form some kind of a international joint commission? It's going to be a challenge because we have the same provincial challenges that you have from an interstate standpoint as well. And so I think that's going to be the biggest challenge. I think there would be broad consensus between the national governments. It's trying to bring the subnational governments into some of those discussions and get an agreement that will likely get tripped up upon.
Could I just add that in the United States, obviously we are focusing on electricity. In the United States today, electricity sector accounts for 27% of emissions. In Canada, I don't know the number, but it must be a lot lower than that.
Low 20s.
Low 20s. I would have thought even lower, but anyway, lower for sure. What I'm getting at is the complement means that there is 70-something% of the emissions in the energy economy which are not electricity. And a lot of that is very hard to address. One of the corollaries is, of course, we need to get as much electrification of the other sectors as we can. So it's not only the lifeline of today that you mentioned, but it is an essential part of meeting long-term decarbonization goals to electrify what we can, at least, in the rest of the energy economy.
Yeah, to that point, our first target is a 30% reduction by 2030 from 2005 levels. Well, in the electricity sector, we've already done that in Canada. And I believe in the United States, with the move from coal to natural gas, you've already achieved that as well. So you're right. I mean, the problem isn't the electricity sector. It's all of the other sectors.
Well, we haven't achieved 30%, but over 60% of the reduction has come from the natural gas for coal, natural gas and renewables coal substitution.
Right.
Which, by the way, had a lot to do with economics, not just.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Well, it had everything to do with economics, to be honest.
Which is convenient.
I mean, that part of the reduction, Right.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the definition of low-hanging fruit in the dictionary, you see a picture of coal to gas.
Yeah.
I mean,
But in fact, on that, if I could just add that, so natural gas and the fracking revolution has clearly driven through market forces a large part of the CO2 reduction. But the reality is, so the answer to the question of whether natural gas is part of the solution or part of the problem to climate change is yes, right? It's part of the solution for some period today, And eventually, without other actions, it's part of the problem. Once you want to go to net zero or 80%. But that's where there's another commonality between the United States and Canada, and that is that we do have a common but inadequate, in my view, focus on getting carbon capture and sequestration really established as a major possibility. I would note something that we at EFI found to our surprise when we looked at decarbonization pathways for California to meet its 40% economy-wide reduction by 2030. We were quite surprised to find that in our analysis, carbon capture in California could account for almost 20% of the solution through both power NGCC plants and industrial plants. The only little detail is that there's nothing happening. But there's still 11 years, so who knows. But that's an example of something where I think the US and Canada we could really put our shoulder to the wheel in terms of innovating in that sector.
Agreed.
Which of course gets me back to my pet theory that each of these things are almost episodic or ad hoc, and if we had a more concentration, I'm just a believer that without creating an inordinate bureaucracy, there has to be an institution that advances this kind of international collaborative effort.
I think we know what your recommendation is.
Yes. So tell me from your perspective, recognizing that in Ontario there are 50% plus power generation today from nuclear, and it's the largest province in Canada. It employs a lot of people, a lot of workers are there. It's a technology presumably of the future, not just of the past. Is that a solution to some of our challenges, particularly in the northern part of the United States?
Interesting question. Well, first of all, I won't dwell on this, but it's fairly clear that the fate of today's nuclear power plants is a very, very critical issue in terms of the carbon equation. And again, this has been and there remains a lot of pressure for closure. I would call it premature closure of today's nuclear plants particularly in the organized, for the United States in the organized markets. Second point, because you mentioned northern part of the United States, I would observe, truth in disclosure, I'm on the board of Southern Company, which is building the two plants in Georgia, that it's not an accident that those plants are being built in the southeast as opposed to the northeast, given regulatory structures.
I'm paying the rates in Georgia.
Next,
I live in Atlanta.
and they're not bad, those rates, in reality.
Carbon footprint will go down.
The third point is, of course, we all know that those plants are nearly a factor of 2 over budget and beyond schedule. And I believe that points us to the conclusion, at least points me to the conclusion, that I honestly don't see any further construction of large nuclear plants taking place anytime soon, and maybe forever, to be perfectly honest, unless there's a lot more
Because of cost?
discipline over the cost and schedule issues. But finally, I do nevertheless think that there is a potentially critical pathway with the so-called small modular reactors, and especially in Canada with what you might call micro reactors to service remote communities, mining operations, and the like. It reflects the fact, I think if you take a step back, you'd have to say that in the United States and Canada today, there has never been so much innovation in the nuclear sector. We're talking like 30 companies with generally private, mostly private capital, advancing alternative approaches. In the U.S. and Canada, examples are, we see a NuScale, which is a light water reactor, really making a lot of progress in the regulatory arena, et cetera. We see other examples in Canada. I will again disclose that as an advisor to Terrestrial, which is a molten salt reactor, so a generation 4 reactor, et cetera. And these modular reactors hold out a promise that we need to see whether the dog hunts by building these reactors, to see whether the economies of manufacturing, which can be incredibly important, in fact, bring home those technologies for much more economic deployment and much better financial engineering. But I think we still have a problem that I think is going to require, let me say, maybe some institutional structures, that we need some private-public partnership. There are many options, but none being really taken up, to move any and all of those technologies across the finish line for getting the kind of capital to actually build the plants and not just develop them to the point of where they can be built. So we have a lot of work to do. We've got to figure out how the U.S. and or Canadian governments, again, help get those technologies across the finish line, to build a bunch of them. And I emphasize a bunch of them. Building one does not solve the problem of understanding the economics of manufacturing and quality assurance.
And I should point out that there is Canada-U.S. integration in this field as well, because a substantial amount of the uranium that is used in the nuclear power industry in the United States is supplied by a Canadian uranium producer, Cameco, which is the largest investor-owned producer of uranium in the world. Let me go and see, in the 5 minutes we seem to have left, sorry for not going to the audience quicker. Are there some, yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Barbara Tyler with the Electric Power Research Institute, Berkeley. We've talked a lot about the cleaner generation mix, of course, transmission, and Gordon, you mentioned the lawsuit, but there is another lawsuit that started this week, and I'm looking at Richard, because Richard, with your investor relations background and financial expertise, although any panelist is welcome to answer this, what is your take on the ExxonMobil climate change case? How significant is that, and where do you see all of this evolving?
Yeah, I think that the positive thing for the investor-owned electric and gas companies is that we're out in front of this issue on ESG, environment, social governance, and climate change. Most of our members have put forward 2030, 2050 goals, and we have a standard way to address these ESG issues with investors and all the stakeholders. And I think that one of the things we kind of glossed over a little bit, but I mean, this dramatic transition that the industry has undertaken over the last decade of going from a fleet of about 50% coal to one that's about 1/3 carbon-free, 2/3 no to low carbon, is really dramatic. And I think that if we weren't on that trajectory, that we would be getting and really realizing a lot of pushback from the big institutions that provide the capital for our industry. As I said when I started, the capital markets are open to our companies, and that's a great thing because of the needed investment that, to get the integration that we've been talking about today, to continue this trajectory to this lower carbon energy economy. So I think that Exxon is being impacted by this. I think it relates to this movement across, particularly with the largest institutional investors on ESG. And I think the fact that our industry is out in front of it has given us a great position in that we're not seen as defensive on it. We're actually seen as being positive in that sense. So I think it's important. It's good to look at in terms of what happens if you decide you don't want to go down that path or you have other ideas on it. I will say though, in terms of the low carbon mix and what we're doing in terms of our CapEx for gas generation, we're very much interested in looking at methane throughout the gas chain. And so I think that is something that we're really focused on right now, is working with the gas industry to address the methane issue. And I think particularly midstream, upstream processors, we're working very closely with them, because we're now the single largest end user of natural gas. In the US, we use about 30 BCF a day of natural gas, and our LDCs use about 11 or 12 BCF a day. So that's a huge amount. So I think that addressing that, and as the Secretary pointed out, I think we definitely need to look at CCS and as we're using more and more of it. And I think the next big frontier for us, now that in the U.S. the stationary sources aren't the largest emitters of carbon, I think the next big frontier, and a lot of the great work EPRI's doing, is on EVs and electrification of transportation. That's a huge opportunity and a way to really make a big impact to continue this sustainability effort that we're in.
I think the Secretary's got
Yeah,
to
my apologies,
sneak
but I
out
have
here.
another public event I have to manage in a few minutes, but thank you all. And
Thank you for coming. Yes, sir, Ed.
Michael Brooks, RTO Insider. I heard some not so subtle criticism of the organized markets from Secretary Moinz. I wish I could ask him about that, but from your perspective, how can the organized markets in the U.S. Facilitate decarbonization, and how do they compare to the ISOs and RTOs, or the two ISOs in Canada, and how are they helping or hurting with decarbonization in that country?
Well, I mean, I think that that if you look at the profiles of the companies in those RTO markets, in many cases, these are companies that are leaders in the movement toward decarbonization. So, I mean, I think that the outcome, what you're seeing in those markets, is a movement toward decarbonization. I think you might have been mentioning the fact that in some of those organized markets, the nuclear fleet has been under pressure. And I think that that issue is being addressed. The markets are addressing those issues, but also the states that are within those markets are also looking to address those issues to sustain those plants. So, I mean, I think there's just a recognition that that it makes sense to maintain a diverse fleet, and that nuclear is part of the answer going forward. So I think there's an effort to sustain those plants, but I think it's something that's a focus of at the market level, certainly at the company level, at the market level, and at the state level. It's just being dealt with at those three levels.
Francis, do you have a view from Canada?
Not specific. I mean, far be it from me to tell my colleagues in the United States how to organize their markets. I would, however, just point out that a number of years ago, and the horse has already left the barn, but a number of years ago we advocated for a price on carbon that was North American, and so that there would be fairness across the markets and consistent. That's a wonderful dream. And it's certainly not where we are today, but clearly we for quite some time had advocated for price signals specifically, and so that it isn't left exclusively to the market, that there is a policy thumb on the scale.
Well, in a harmonized, if not identical, regime in North America would be helpful.
Yes. Sorry, further supports your argument.
Yes, sir.
John Stephenson with the Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. And in our work, it's pretty clear that the fundamental conflict is that there are many benefits at a national, local scale on economics and jobs, which is the subject of this panel. And there is great resistance at a more micro scale to people for the impacts that building out the grid, for example, has. And yet, in politics, it's the economy, stupid. People vote with their pocketbooks. People are driven by economics and job prospects. How can the industry communicate the benefits of the grid adequately to overcome the political opposition to building it out?
Well, I think each of you ought to take a crack at that. So let's start at the end and move.
Okay.
'Cause I think labor is a big part of that message.
You'd like me to
Go ahead.
Okay,
Let's
great.
start at the end and move.
So I think that is a challenge. I think, to some degree, one of the ways that focus people on the value of electricity is when it doesn't, when there's an interruption in that. And so, I think that what we're seeing is that as the economy becomes increasingly electrified, people are much more conscious of it. I think that the trend that we were talking about in terms of electrification of transportation will make people even more aware of the value of the integrated grid. But I think it's up to, the large associations, our member companies, and others to just continue to communicate the importance of it. And I mean, as was said earlier, we, in terms of a driver in the economy, our companies are spending over $100 billion a year in CapEx, and that's having a multiplier effect on the economy in terms of jobs and in terms of tax base and all of that. So I think that is something that's really important for the industry to communicate, and we are.
Yeah, the grid system, of course, and the transmission, was really, in the United States, was all developed back in the 60s. So we're outdated. So we need to modernize our grid and to meet the demands, that's going on today. And so I think that, economically and everything, it is going to provide a lot of jobs, a lot of specialized jobs into making that transition and modernizing our grid system, not only to be able to supply the power as needed, but also cybersecurity and everything else. There's a lot of things that need to be integrated moving forward that to prepare for the transition, like you said, of the more electrical use. We're going to have more electrical demand, not less, and we've got to be able to have the system that's ready to carry that demand, and that's going to mean a lot of investment by our utility companies and private investments as well, to be able to get the source of power where it's generated, regardless of what the source of generation is, to where it's needed, and that means getting the transmission there. A lot of DC lines. We've had opportunities to build some DC power from where you could have some strong wind in Nebraska and Kansas and others, and then how do you get that source where the big demand into the big cities? Because you're not going to see a bunch of windmills, in the cities. So a lot of that's in the rural area. So again, we've got to be able to get the source from the power to get it to where the demand is, in those urban areas. So it's got to be all part of the equation. I think everybody understand that's going to be an investment. It's going to be some cost, but long term, it's one of those investments you can't afford not to make.
And I just want to add one thing to that. In addition to all that, electricity remains a tremendous value. On an inflation-adjusted basis, electricity is one of the best values consumers have. So, I mean, I think that, as my friend over here, Steve Mitnick of Public Utility Fortnightly, always points out, and if you look at the basket of commodities, it's a tremendous value. So that's something we do need to communicate as well.
So, Francis, you get the last word.
All right. Well, the challenge is the transition, right? It isn't so much. We know the future is going to have different opportunities. How do we get people from where they are today to where they are, in 2050? Are we in fact going to be moving away from coal? Fine. Then what is the transition for those people that are in that business? If 100 years ago your business was manufacturing buggy whips,
Yeah.
you needed to figure out pretty darn quick what your transition is going to be to begin with from the power side of things. So we're of course going to need far fewer people, and Lonnie, you've mentioned it, far fewer people in coal, but in solar installers and wind, and all of these new technologies are taking place. But at the same time, the other side of it is when we're talking about greater electrification of the economy as a whole. So electric vehicles, new technologies, new products, new services. Boy, I sure hope that we are going to be on the leading edge here in North America, and I hope that we're going to lead in the development and the production of those products. Like today, we have Tesla. I hope 20 years from now we're producing even more and more of those vehicles and those new technologies here in North America.
In our countries.
Yeah.
So let me thank the panel. Terrific job. Great perspective and diverse perspective. thank the audience for paying attention to us for this hour. And Jim, it's back to you.
Okay, thank you.